I don't know if you don't know Nick Nielsen, you should know Nick Nielsen. Nick Nielsen is one of the, we're so honored to have him as part of Icarus Interstellar. I flatter him all the time, and it's one of my pleasures. I read voraciously. I have my entire life. He's written a text that people are unfamiliar with. It's in the books that I hold my life against. Sun Tzu's Art of War, the Tao Te Ching, the Bible. He thinks I'm joking. This is an amazing speaker, an amazing thinker, Nick Nielsen.
Thank you. So now it's my turn to struggle with the clicker. Is it the one on the right then?
The one on the right moves forward, the center is the laser, and the left goes back.
Okay. So I'm going to try to address a couple questions here, and I hope you'll take everything that I say as somewhat tentative, because I work through these ideas all the time, and I don't regard any of this as a definitive formulation. So, what is the role of the moon in space-based infrastructure and the initial build-out of a spacefaring civilization? And what is the role of the moon in the eventual interstellar build-out of spacefaring civilization? So what do I mean by build-out? When I use the term build-out, I mean the process by which a civilization or civilizations build an economic infrastructure and intellectual superstructure in order to fulfill the central project of that civilization. So that's a bit of a mouthful, and I'll try to talk about what I mean by that. I like to talk about civilization in terms of an economic infrastructure. That's the ways and means by which we do things. The intellectual superstructure, which is the meanings, the values, the ideas, and the central project, which is the purpose, the raison d'etre we have for doing things. And we've seen this in ancient civilizations where we have impressive infrastructure projects like aqueducts and schools for the intellectual infrastructure. We saw it in medieval civilization, once again, infrastructure and an intellectual superstructure. And in our contemporary world today, we're still building infrastructure, and we still have our distinctive forms of intellectual superstructures that give us our meanings and values by which we interpret that economic infrastructure. So when we look at civilization before the Industrial Revolution, you can find that almost every civilization had a religion or religious surrogate as its central project. And that goes, that probably extends way before a civilization. We're all familiar with the famous cave paintings, which most people considered sacred spaces. The oldest known cave paintings are about 40 or 45,000 years old, well into the Paleolithic, long before the Holocene warming of the climate, long before the earliest signs of agricultural civilization. So I strongly suspect that religion is the core of the central project of most of these early agricultural civilizations, and the other institutions grow organically out from that center. And in a rough template of a pre-modern civilization, you've got an economic infrastructure that consists of pastoralism, that means raising animals, agriculture, craft specialization, and then mythology, theology, cosmology, and other intellectual and artistic enterprises as the elaboration on the intellectual side of the central project. So an example, I'll take Egyptian civilization, where the infrastructure and superstructure are quite closely integrated with each other. They almost completely coincide. Of course, there was some economics that didn't have much to do with central project. Lapis lazuli had to be purchased from Badakhshan in what is now Afghanistan. And almost all the technologies the Egyptians used were borrowed from Mesopotamia, but of course they made them their own. But almost everything that happened in relation to the central project. What an example of this, the mortuary temple of Ramses II. A mortuary temple is where the dead emperor, the dead pharaoh was worshipped as a god, basically. And at this mortuary temple of Ramses II, you see all the shaded areas are what archaeologists believe were grain storage areas. So you've got a civilization where the temples are crucial to the economic infrastructure because they're stores, grain stores, and the priests of the temple would predict the annual flooding of the Nile, which was crucial to Egyptian agriculture. And if you've ever looked at a picture of the Nile when it actually floods, before the Aswan Dam was made and it kind of changed the hydraulics of the area, the whole Nile area just gets covered in several feet of water. And every single year, they had to resurvey that farmland in order to divvy it up again at the end of the next year, or for the next growing season. And so that's where a lot of earliest geometry came from, and is a crucial part of the civilization that took place in the Nile Valley. We have a little more differentiation in medieval European civilization, which I take the central project to be feudalism and the chivalric ideal as elaborated in Christianity. But there's a lot more that's happening outside the central projects. Jews were tolerated as a religious minority, as the only tolerated religious minority. But that was partly for economic reasons, because Christians were forbade to lend money at interest to other Christians. Jews were allowed to because they weren't part of that central project of Christendom. So even the Jews who stood outside the central project, everything that they did within Christendom was mediated through the central project. There's also increasing trade with the non-European world. Of course, the Silk Road had a trickle of commodities overland, and there was increasing use of water mills and windmills that was crucial. On the intellectual superstructure side, there were heretics. Of course, heretics were treated horribly and were burned when they were discovered, but there were heretics, and that's significantly. There were almost no heretics in Egyptian civilization. You may have heard of Akhenaten, the heretic king. That wasn't a grassroots movement. That was one man, and then as soon as he was out of the picture, his name was removed from monuments, and he was basically a non-person until he was rediscovered by archaeologists. And there was an incredible tradition of, just to take one example, a personal favorite of mine, scholastic logic. It was all done at universities that were run by the church, but you can tell when you read it that it was done for the pure joy of the theoretical interest. So there's a lot going on outside the central project. And with greater differentiation comes a greater likelihood of exaptation. Exaptation is a term from evolutionary biology, where a structure or a behavior that evolves under one selection pressure comes to be employed for a different function. The classic example of that is feathers. Probably were evolved as a heat regulation mechanism, as insulation, and then they became, adapted for use as display and then as flight. So when you've got all this stuff going on outside the central project, you've got a lot of things going on that can then take on a life of their own and go in different directions. And we saw that with the medieval European civilization. You had this project of medieval Christendom, and here in this wonderful painting of the Virgin of the Navigators, you see Mary, Mother of God, with her cloak around all the ships of exploration that would become so important in the next stage of European history. So when Europe, in recovering from the Black Death, built out this enormous shipping capacity, no one was thinking about, we're going to use this to go around the Horn of Africa, and we're going to use this to go to the New World. They built out the capacity, the economic infrastructure for shipping, and then it got used for other things. In contemporary industrialized civilization, we have an enormous amount of differentiation. In fact, I think it would be pretty controversial to try to identify a central project. I personally would suggest that the central project is the Enlightenment project, which was, you find in writers like Montesquieu and Hume and Locke, and then was translated into political institutions in the United States Constitution. But it's arguable. I can easily imagine any of you suggesting an alternative way to interpret contemporary civilization. But you don't have to have much of a relationship to any central project to do just fine in the contemporary world. Almost everybody has a job. Very few people live off inherited money. So you don't have to be related to the central project to earn an income. That's your economic infrastructure. And there's a lot going on in the superstructure that has nothing to do with, or very little to do with the central project. We've got a lot going on. So I'm going to propose what I call the social differentiation conjecture. I just showed you 3 examples of civilization. Egypt, where they closely coincide. Medieval Europe, where there's a little more differentiation. In the contemporary civilization, where there's a lot of differentiation, and the central project has become very marginal. But I wasn't meaning to show you that in the progression through history. What I mean to show you, oh, that was accidental, is I think if you were to examine each of these civilizations in detail, that you would find as they grow and mature, they become much more differentiated. And it's a lot like ecological succession, where you, after a denudation event, after a storm or something, clears everything out, then you get the weeds, and then you get the shrubs, and then you eventually get a tree and a climax ecosystem. But I'm suggesting that a highly diverse civilization like ours today is high in social complexity. And I think this could be empirically tested if we had the proper measures for civilization, but that in itself would be a very large task to try to say how exactly you ought to measure a civilization, and in reasonably objective ways that you could compare civilizations across time, which is very difficult because we can't go back in time to get that kind of good quantifiable information. So we begin with planetary endemism, that is to say we are endemic to the planet Earth, and the build-out of regional civilizations have converged upon essentially a planetary civilization. We're not unified politically or legally, but we're unified in terms of communications, in terms of our economy, in terms of art. All of these things are nearly planetary, if not officially or formally, informally. And that our build-out of our terrestrial civilization, our planetary system, has gone beyond the scope of our planet. We have more than 1,000 active satellites in orbit, and functioning satellites in orbit. There's thousands of more pieces of space junk. And so we built out an extraterrestrial infrastructure, even though our civilization is primarily terrestrial. So we've got this build out, we've got differentiation, we've got opportunities for exaptation, and the build out of our space-based infrastructure has also included, of course, a lot of human missions, but these human missions have been almost entirely within the paradigm of the geopolitics of Earth. We have, of course, the Cold War space race, and then with the Apollo-Soyuz, we've got a space program that's more in line with the politics of détente. And even when we look forward to, here's Jeff Bezos' Blue Origins rocket, the extraterrestrial expansion of civilization, which Bezos' vision is primarily based on Gerard K. O'Neill's vision of millions of people living and working in space. It's still the idea of a civilization that's based on Earth and has spread its tentacles outward, but really nothing in essentials has changed. And there are forms of infrastructure in space that never got built or were abandoned. This is an artist's impression of the Soviet Almaz space station. They actually orbited, I think, 3 of these. The first one of them actually had a gun attached to it. They were intended as crewed missions for surveillance and as a test bed for military applications in space. It turned out that it just made much more sense, and technology advanced so rapidly that it was just much better to build a spy satellite and set it up rather than mess with a human crew on a satellite merely for observation purposes. The U.S. considered the same and almost built the manned orbital laboratory, but then our U.S. technology tended to be advanced in Russian technology, so they made the same conclusion that it's just easier to build satellites. So from considerations like this, you get the incentive trap. Why do you build something difficult and expensive today when you can wait for something easy, better, and cheaper tomorrow? And that leads to what I call the waiting gamut. If we wait for the right moment, everything will just be great. And you know, if we have to put up with conditions that they are now, well, that's just what you have to do. The waiting gamut, of course, can be iterated indefinitely, and this becomes stagnation if it does. Nick Bostrom, who was the one who came up with the term existential risk, identified permanent stagnation. We're not at the level of permanent stagnation, but we also have not yet built a spacefaring civilization. I would say that I make a subtle distinction between a terrestrial civilization with a rudimentary spacefaring capacity, which we certainly do have, and an actual spacefaring civilization, which is a civilization in space. So in our highly differentiated contemporary civilization, we have a very uneven build-out, which I consider a consequence of suboptimality. No civilization is perfect. Even if there's a grand plan, it doesn't get built out exhaustively. There's always details that escape. So things happen unevenly. Build-out of the central project is often exapted by independent growth, something, you know, that was completely unexpected, like the rapid growth of computer technology. It just grows until it overtakes the economy and becomes a central driver, even if it has very little relation to the central project of a civilization. Infrastructure investment is inherently risk-averse. It's career suicide to sign off on a multi-billion-dollar investment that doesn't deliver on its promises. And that's why we're still building coal-fired electrical plants and natural gas. Natural gas is, you know, the preferred method now because it's cleaner than coal, but it's still within the same paradigm. You know, we have easily the technology to build large-scale solar, wind, and things like that, but no, what utility company executive is going to sign off on it? So we have uneven stagnation because we've got uneven development, we've got uneven stagnation, but there are still a whole lot of space-based infrastructure build-out opportunities. So I'm going to go through a list I've created. This is not to be taken as exhaustive. It's just what I worked out when I was working on this presentation. We've already gone past the null case. That's where you don't build any space-based infrastructure. We have, you know, automated space-based infrastructure that starts in 1957 with Sputnik and continues to the present day. We've got automated planet-based. When I say planet, I mean planet, dwarf planet, or moon, or even an asteroid or a comet. That's a surveyor. And once again, this started early in the space age and continues to the present day with rovers on the surface of Mars right now. We've got transient human space-based presence, which has started with Yuri Gagarin's trip and continuing to the present day. Human planet-based transient, and that is, you know, like a quick visit to the moon. So we've done that too, and whoops. An enduring space-based present. We've got that far. With the International Space Station has been occupied continuously since November of 2000, so almost 17 years. So that's an enduring presence. We haven't made it so far as an enduring presence on a planet. This is, somebody used this other slide in their presentation, I think it was yesterday. This was, I think, originally for the Hilton Hotel on the Moon. That was a popular meme back in the 60s, before there were memes, as it were. That would be an enduring planet-based settlement. But beyond just being enduring, like a hotel on the moon or the International Space Station, there's a self-sustaining presence. This is a classic Bernal sphere from Gerard K. O'Neill's space program, where you can actually put something up in space and you can live there and you don't need to necessarily come back to Earth or come back to a planet. And a planet-based, self-sustaining human presence. And this is a great 1950s style illustration of that. So the build-out of a particular infrastructure represents one possibility among others, and the build-out of that particular possibility represents a trajectory for civilization. So when we build things now, we're creating an agenda for the future, even if we don't know it, because things don't just happen, we prepare the ground for them to happen. So to talk about how some of these infrastructures relate to particular pathways for the development of civilization, consider a mission to Mars, as has been talked about a lot since Elon Musk's proposal a couple of years ago. A mission to Mars would need to be a self-sustaining, well, not necessarily. It could be in just a scientific mission there that comes back, but the way it was proposed by Elon Musk and several others is it's a self-sustaining human planetary setup mission. And you have to necessarily have a space-based transient presence. You have to move through space to get there. So that's your necessary infrastructure for that kind of Martian mission. And that gives you the vision of Robert Zubrin. This plan employs no immense interplanetary spaceships, requires neither orbiting space bases nor storage facilities. Instead, a crew and their habitat are sent directly to Mars, etc. This is pretty much the architecture that has been adopted by the Mars One people and by Elon Musk. It's very infrastructure sparse, purposefully. The idea was to create an idea for a pursuit of a Mars mission where you didn't have to first build all the satellites and build the construction spaces in space. You just launch it from the ground, and that's it. Say you want to build an enormous multi-generational space ark to go to another star. Well, you need a lot more infrastructure than that. You need, at very least, space-based, enduring construction. You couldn't build something like that, I'm assuming, on the surface of Earth because it just would be too big and you couldn't lift it off the surface. You'd probably also need to get your resources off planets or moons. It would be better if that infrastructure was self-sustaining. So once you start building something like that, you're going to have to build a lot of other infrastructure. So that's a very infrastructure-heavy idea. If we take something very exotic, like the Alcubierre drives, talked about by Miguel Alcubierre himself yesterday, this is actually compatible with the null case. You could literally have no infrastructure in space and still build something. Obviously, we've already gone beyond that, and you would have a transient present in space by having a ship like that. And we're not going to get rid of our automated space-based infrastructure that we have, so we've got that infrastructure there. But it would be a lot like building a submarine. You don't build a submarine underwater. You build a submarine in a big dry dock. It's one of the most complex construction projects ever undertaken. They spend literally years working on these before their first sea trials, and they're pretty much ready to go when they're put in the water. And we might do the same thing someday with a spaceship. This is a classic Klaus Bergel illustration of a spaceship being built in a hangar. And if we had the right technologies, you wouldn't even need to build space-based infrastructure. You could just build your rocket and fly it right off the surface of the planet and into hyperspace like the Millennium Falcon. So, given the fact that the infrastructure we build is already preparing the ground for what comes next, what are we building for ourselves now? With something like the International Space Station, this is a research station or an industrial depot or a storage place is built for a specific purpose. It's not built to be just anything. Well, the space station was a compromise because a lot of nation states were involved in it, but it's not going to be much more than a space station. Everybody knows that. Even if you built 1,000 of them, you still wouldn't have a spacefaring civilization. You'd have a lot of people in space, but not much more than that. There have been continuous human presence, for example, in Antarctica since 1956. There's 1,000 people in Antarctica year-round. At the height of the summer season, there's about 4,000 people there. But we wouldn't speak of an Antarctic civilization. It's just not, all the bases are highly specialized, and it's just not the kind of thing that you would call a civilization. So if we built a hotel on the moon, or a hotel in space for that matter, you'd have an enduring human presence, but you still wouldn't have a lunar civilization. If you built a mining facility, say you wanted to get the helium-3 for fusion, you'd be part of the economic infrastructure of a larger civilization, but once again, it's not really a lunar civilization. And my favorite project on the moon, and something many people have talked about, a far-side lunar radio telescope where there's no electromagnetic interference from Earth. That would be great, but it wouldn't be a civilization. It would be part of the intellectual superstructure of a civilization that's not based on the moon. You would get a civilization on the moon when the residents of the moon would converge on their own central project that's distinct from that of terrestrial civilization. So any civilization that were to emerge on the moon, it might even have its origins in a research station or an economic infrastructure. But those things are going to be selected, subject to selection pressures. But they're also at the same time opportunities. Low gravity is a human health risk, but it also would make possible the construction of megastructures. I have had people tell me that with current technology, we could probably build a lunar space elevator, even though we probably couldn't build one on the Mars or Earth just because the material strengths are so much different. There's no atmosphere. That's a problem in terms of oxygen supply and air pressure, but it's great for telescopes, and Tiffany Frierson mentioned it's also great for quantum vacuum science. You've got no biosphere, so that's a problem for food supply and the kind of soils you need, but it's great because you're not going to be contaminated by anything, and there's no biosphere to pollute if you create industries there. The diurnal cycle is different. People might have difficulty sleeping or be disoriented, but you also get 2 weeks of uninterrupted light. There's probably a downside to the moon's tidal locking to Earth. I couldn't think of it. Probably somebody else could think of it. But the good side of that is far-side radio silence. And the proximity to Earth, in cosmological terms, the moon is a huge body close to Earth. Everything else in the solar system is very very distant, excuse me. So it'd be very difficult for the moon to establish its independence, but it has great ease of interaction with Earth. So you might have a lunar civilization emerge from a terrestrial biosphere backup, like the Svalbard seed vault, or a terrestrial internet backup, a supercomputer on the moon storing as backup of all our data, far-side lunar telescope, communications relay to the solar system, or a lunar space elevator. Big projects usually result in large numbers of people. But the selection pressures on the moon would be so different from the selection pressures on either Earth or Mars that different institutions would emerge from that. So similarly, when the Spanish came to the Americas, they tried to bring their institutions with them. A lot of the earliest buildings built in the Americas by Europeans were actually designed in Spain and then built here. And they brought over priests and they brought over Jesuits who built schools, but it didn't work out like it was planned. Because a central project is a way of integrating the infrastructure and superstructure under different selection pressures. Those infrastructures and superstructures get integrated in different ways. And so the civilization of Spanish America is very different than the civilization of the Iberian Peninsula. So a lunar civilization, if one eventually emerges, would exert a very strong selective effect on its inhabitants. And because it would be highly selective, it would also exhibit lower degrees of social differentiation than we see on Earth. Because the people going to the moon would likely be highly educated, science literate, willing to risk new things, familiar with space because they would be working in space, and they would be the people who were healthy in space environments. If you go to the moon or you go to an artificial settlement in orbit and you get sick, either you die or you go home, but you won't be passing along your genes in space, and that's going to have, over generations, a very significant cumulative effect. And if a lunar civilization evolves and matures, it too would eventually become differentiated and subject to exaptation. And that means that the first human exocivilization, if the first human exocivilization on the moon is on the moon, would be a staging point for the next development of civilization beyond the build-out of our planetary system, and that would, of course, be interstellar build-out and the role of the moon in interstellar build-out. So we've already seen in what we've done in spacefaring development so far an established pattern of ascending automated probes first, followed by human missions. It's likely it's likely that we'll see a continuation of that. And spacefaring build-out within our solar system is likely to be iterated at interstellar scales. There's certainly a potential question for that. And earlier today, and when Angelo Vermeulen spoke, he talked about how one of the differences in interstellar exploration is that everything we've done incrementally to date, and you can't incrementally do space settlement. That may or may not be true. If you drive civilization all the way out into the Oort cloud, you're getting close to the Oort cloud if there is one of nearby star systems, and there might be an incremental way to the stars. It's not really clear yet. And civilizations that have already established as a spacefaring civilization have a great advantage over a terrestrial civilization. People living and working on the moon or living and working on artificial habitats, they're going to be selected for being good at what they do in space, and they're going to already be in space, and they're going to be positioned uniquely. If anybody's going to build interstellar ships, they're likely to be built in space. And you could argue that we're already in the leading edge of the interstellar age. Here's a quote from Jim Bell that with Voyager crossing out into the interstellar medium, that it's the beginning of the interstellar age. And like I was saying a minute ago, this could slowly diffuse out to other stars, or it might be a sudden jump, especially if we get a breakthrough technology like the Alcubierre drive, and we can build a spaceship or a starship right on the surface of Earth and fly it directly under other stars. We might learn more about other stars than we know about our own solar system. We just don't know what's going to work best yet. So earlier, I gave a generic template for agricultural civilization. So this is my generic template for a spacefaring civilization. We're going to have some kind of technologically facilitated energy production. We're going to have social amenities, housing. We're going to have consumer goods, obviously. We're going to have science, art, philosophy, all kinds of intellectual activities going on. But what's going to be the central project of a spacefaring civilization? And I think that's a more difficult question than it appears at first, because can you just make up a central project of a civilization? I don't think that's very likely. So here's a quote, maybe a bit acerbic, from the late Ludwig Wittgenstein. This is something he was in his posthumously published writings about speaking Esperanto. Our feeling of disgust when we utter an invented word with its derivative syllables. The word is cold and has no associations, and it plays at language. When you actually speak a language, part of your life, you're living a language. And according to this quote from Wittgenstein, that sense of artificiality is repellent to some people. Maybe not to everyone, but to some people. I don't regard this as the final word, because here's another quote from Wittgenstein. A new word is like a fresh seed thrown on the ground of a discussion. So I agree with that as well. But a new word isn't a new language. But you can, if you put enough new words together, you can come to a new language. But it takes time. And the central projects that organically emerge from the life of a people will be in spacefaring civilization. It's what organically emerges from the life of a people who are living and working in space. And if, say, we build out a spacefaring infrastructure and it evolves for 200-300 years inside our solar system, that would be sufficient time to create a new central project. But if you're just jumping directly into a big spacefaring enterprise, you're going to be borrowing from the past for your central project. One of the ways in which spacefaring civilization will be different, I meant to say, is that the overview effect will be part of ordinary lived experience for people every day who are off the planet. So, a historical parallel here. When Constantine the Great founded Constantinople, the city to bear his name, in 330 AD, he founded on the earlier Greek city of Byzantium, which was very small, but he basically went to all the old pagan capitals in the ancient world, Rome and Antioch and Alexandria. He looted their best statuary and their best art, and he brought it back to Constantinople, and he created a new capital for a new Christian emperor. He was the first Christian emperor, and that city became incredibly successful. Constantinople remained as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire until 1453, when it was conquered by the Turks, by Mehmet II. The historian John Roberts characterized the Byzantine civilization as, quote, a machine for getting people into heaven, unquote. And that shows you, that is what a central project is. And you know, if you've never been to Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, it's incredible. Just to go there. There's a place in the floor where the guards stood for 1,000 years. On each side of the main door, there's a dip in the stone. It's about 3 or 4 inches deep from where guards stood there at attention when the emperor walked through the door for more than 1,000 years. So this is a very robust and stable civilization. But when Constantine started, he was, like I said, the first Christian emperor. When Constantine started, who founded Constantinople as his city, Christianity was already more than 300 years old by that time. It had been through a rigorous selection process. It had had the persecutions of Diocletian. It had had numerous heresies that the leadership of the young church had to fight off. So you already had a very robust social institution waiting in the wings. And by Constantine giving it its own city, its own capital, it could then take off in its own direction. So he didn't just make up a new civilization, but a new civilization arose from his foundation of Constantinople. So, central projects of spacefaring civilization. It doesn't seem likely to me that you can just make something up and it's going to work. It's got to organically grow out of the lived experience of people. And it probably already has to be present and available for exaptation, even if it's only in a nascent state. You know, there's all kinds of ideas floating around that could be exapted for a spacefaring civilization. We don't know which are going to be successful in a spacefaring context. It probably wouldn't work to revive a defunct idea. Central projects of the past, you know, we couldn't dig up Egyptian civilization again and create a pharaoh who becomes identical with a god after he dies. The selection pressures under which civilizations come about are so different, it just wouldn't work. Nobody could take it seriously. So we're probably going to end up with a modification of an existing idea. So say, for example, you had a truly scientific civilization that had science or the growth of scientific knowledge as its central project. And an ideology that is sometimes called scientism, which isn't identical with science, but a belief system that's based on science. That's one possibility. From humanism, we might derive transhumanism, and that could change a lot of other things. For those who are enthusiasts of the idea of the singularity, obviously if there's a singularity and a hard landing, everything that I've said about human civilizations becomes a lot less relevant because humans won't be in charge. From the Enlightenment, we might derive a post-Enlightenment project that's been informed by the successes and the failures of what the Enlightenment tried to do. From the project of the Age of Discovery and Expansion, we might have interstellar expansion, obviously a favorite of people like me and probably many people in this room. Or similarly, the age of the great explorations. Even into the early 20th century, we were still going to the Challenger Deep and the North Pole and the South Pole. And that's an idea that could be extrapolated to our solar system and largely out into the cosmos. So when human beings arrive at the moon to stay, their first priority will obviously be survival. But after their survival has been assured, they're going to look for something more than survival, and when they do, they will eventually converge upon a central project if a lunar civilization takes root. So, thank you very much.
All right, do we have any questions for Nick?
Angela,
That was the most hands I've seen go up.
That's
thanks for a very, very challenging, interesting, and thought-provoking talk. Really
Thank you.
wonderful. I'm very impressed. I'm always thinking about evolution. What are your thoughts on the divergence within humanity as soon as they start turning into a spacefaring civilization and resulting conflicts? Do you have any ideas about this?
If it happens quickly, it's going to be a very important political hot potato. And if it happens slowly, people will scarcely notice they're grown apart until they discover that they can no longer have kids with people from other planets anymore. So because of the way our culture is now, I wrote a blog post some time ago and I argued both the left and the right have a hard time with natural selection, with human speciation. You can't talk about human speciation in the past without making people on the right mad. You can't talk about human speciation in the future without making people on the left mad. But it's the world we live in. Species diverge. They go extinct. Some of them leave ongoing genetic heritage. Some don't. So I think that's going to be very important in the development of civilization, but it will depend on the infrastructure we build out, at the rate at which our civilization expands, and how, if any political power becomes strong enough to enforce its writ in space and tries to make sure that everybody's an authentic human being and nobody diverges too far from the gene pool. But we know that those divergences will happen. There's the famous equation in evolutionary biology called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and from that you can easily derive that there's always going to be a flow in changes in the allele frequency in a population. So it all depends on how tightly it's controlled and how long it goes on.
And then one second to last question. If you look at the work, for example, from Kim Stanley Robinson, you always see that Earth, even though there's been a lot of evolution and expansion, it remains the center. I mean, it seems that humanity cannot really get away from Earth somehow, psychologically almost. You disagree with that?
Not necessarily. I wrote a blog. Paul Gilster of Centauri Dreams lets me do guest posts on his site, which is great because I get a lot of comments there because he has a lot of readers. So I just 2 or 3 weeks ago I posted something that addresses that, of whether, to what extent our civilization will remain focused on Earth and not be able to break away, and compared to another pathway of civilization, which there's a lot of what I call multiple independent centers of civilization that are, because they're independent, they have to be self-supporting. And that's going to be one of the great political and social challenges of the future if we move beyond the planet. But we don't even know that's going to be, there are no guarantees. We could be stuck in a horrible stagnation for thousands of years, or we could have a glorious future in 50 years. Who knows?
If I understand correctly, you're proposing that interstellar voyage won't be necessarily this heroic thing, going for years and years, but rather the result of a long-term build-up of civilization over time. I think that's absolutely brilliant. I was wondering how you came about it.
Well, I wouldn't exactly agree with that. I don't just necessarily. One of the most difficult questions, something I'm currently working on, but I don't really have a good formulation for, is the intrinsic limits of technology, which we can guess at, but we don't know until it's built. And that's what I was trying to get at with these different infrastructures is, if we discover some, Adam Crowell, who writes the Crowell Space blog, he's already posted a post, even though the M drive has this very, very tiny amount of thrust, that even that is controversial in its measure. He's already calculated what it would take to make a 1G Starship from an M drive. So that's not unlikely technology to happen, but we can't rule it out. And if anything like a 1G Starship or an Alcubierre drive or mastery of wormhole technologies, that could shake things up. And like I said, if you could build a spaceship in your garage at home, put your family in it, and fly it to another solar system to start over, not everybody would do that, but enough people would do it that it would change the structure of life in the cosmos and change the structure of human civilization. Or we could have a very slow model, or we could have an Earth-centered model where everything is very tightly coupled to the planet and people don't have much of an interest in going elsewhere. I don't know if you've ever heard of the transcension hypothesis by John Smart. Many other people are picking up this theme now of, we don't need to go out and explore because with these virtual worlds that we can build with supercomputers will be so elaborate and they'll be more interesting than anything out in space, so people are just going to focus on their home world and build these elaborate virtual environments, and everybody's going to get lost in them, and we don't need to build a spacefaring civilization. That's a vulgar summary of John Smart's idea. But we obviously, all we have to do is look at the science fiction of the past few decades to see the transition from Heinlein and the golden age of science fiction where we're jetting around in rockets, the kind of stuff I read when I was growing up and I absolutely loved. And the science fiction we've gotten since William Gibson's Neuromancer is very much based on artificial intelligence, computers, and very focused on Earth. And talking about interstellar exploration is marginal at best in those scenarios. And that's what's in the public mind today as science fiction. Not exclusively, but to a greater degree in the past, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Fascinating. Your center slice with Constantine was Christianity, where the circles meet each other. And it seemed to me in earlier versions you were talking about historically, that center slice contains some version of what we might call religion, where people are talking to a mystery and asking for help. And in your last bit at the end, where you said, what are the options for the future for that center slice, there was none of this talking to the mystery and asking for help. It seems qualitatively to be very different from the earlier slices, and I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Religion is always going to be with us as human beings because it's perfectly adapted to our evolutionary psychology. We've had literally, like I said, the evidence for religion in human beings, not only the cave paintings, but also burials among Paleolithic peoples. Until we change ourselves, if we change ourselves, that's part of our evolutionary psychology. It's always going to be with us. But it's always going to take different forms. Nobody today could take seriously a god emperor or even, well, I guess the god emperor of Dune, of course. People in science fiction circles love to invoke that. But they're kept tightly isolated. In most of even China has greater internet access than North Korea. So yeah, if you can isolate your nation state sufficiently, but is that sustainable? I don't think this is sustainable in the long term. And but if we re-engineer our minds, then we could have all kinds of central projects. We might even be able to create an artificial central project that would work. But as long as we are human beings in our present constitution, these perennial forces are going to be at work, although they'll take very different forms as time goes on.
My question is for the central project for a spacefaring society. You had a bunch of lists of things that could be possible, but I didn't see intrastellar colonization. Couldn't that be maybe one of the central projects?
Well, generally speaking, I would say that's a part of exploration. I put on the lowest two interstellar exploration or interstellar expansion. Generally speaking, expansion and exploration in space. Our solar system is a big place for us, and we could easily spend thousands of years just giving to every nook and cranny in the solar system and going outward.
But that wouldn't. Well, if that's okay, so because you were saying that once the moon makes their own central project, right? So that expansion wouldn't necessarily be that. Is that the case? That
I am
expansion?
suggesting that if we had the growth of an independent civilization on the moon, they would be uniquely positioned to pursue other spacefaring projects. So they'd be better at it than people on Earth. They'd be closer, and they would be more. They've already been selected by living on the moon for being better in space. So they have an advantage, but we don't know that this is the particular pathway that civilization is going to follow. If nothing like that gets established, then it's going to be a different pathway.
So my question is, what are your thoughts on a survivability motivation for a selection criterion for example, an extinction level event?
I didn't understand that. Go again,
As a
please.
motivator for a central project focused around surviving an extinction level event, asteroids.
Certainly,
overpopulation.
that's a really good point, and that's a scenario where we develop as a spacefaring civilization within our own planetary system for hundreds of years. If people are the hardscrabble future, I can't remember who coined that term, the same guy who came up with the age of M, Robin Hanson. Robin Hanson wrote a book wrote an essay called The Hardscrabble Future. If we have a hardscrabble future within our solar system, and that goes on for hundreds of years, that's long enough for a central project to emerge from the distinctive ways of life that we would find on asteroids, moons, people living in artificial settlements, etc.
Any other questions?
Really enjoyed your talk, Nick. Regarding the central project for civilization, what kind of organization within that civilization do you see as being responsible for identifying, executing, and coordinating that central project? Is that the role of government, or do you foresee that as being an extra-governmental organization?
I think central projects almost always grow out organically out of the life of the people, and people don't even notice them. They precede the foundation of explicit formal institutions of society. And they transcend class differences. One of my favorite examples is if you take the Roman Empire at the height of its extent during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the two most famous Stoic philosophers of ancient Rome were the Emperor Marcus Aurelius and the slave Epictetus, who wrote the Enchiridion. If you've got an idea that motivates people from a slave at the bottom to an emperor at the top, you know that your society is very uniform and focused on that particular conception of the world. And you find that in older societies when there was less diversity, and you find that in early stages of society. But you find that, I think if I'm right about the social differentiation conjecture, you find it a lot less in later societies, but at the same time, because in later, more differentiated societies where the connection to the central project becomes very marginal, and a lot of people don't feel invested. I mean, if you talk to Americans now, try to find somebody who feels excited about the Enlightenment project. You won't find many people. And the transhumanists seem to be closest to it, but a lot of the people who are political representatives don't give a hang about about Enlightenment ideals. I mean, you sound like you were a Martian if you started talking to them about it. But at the same time, then you get what sociologists call anomie, which is the feeling that people get when they're disconnected from any sense of laws or principle. And so you have people who are desperately searching for something to believe in, and they will grasp at anything. Over lunch, I was just talking to a couple of people I was sharing my table with about flat earthers, and how this becomes a surrogate religion where people don't question it. And it's really silly, but it just shows you how desperate people are to believe in something, and that's where central projects come. When enough people believe in something that is actionable, you've got the seed of something that can organize a society.
Nick, I have a question. So in this slide right here, you show this progression. Well, are you familiar with Stirling's Shaper-Mechanist universe? No. Well, there's Earthlings separate, human beings separated into distinct branches of evolution. They live together, but they're completely different. So is this moving to a place where it separates entirely?
I think it certainly can.
And what would happen?
But societies become very dysfunctional and maladaptive they're rootless when they don't have a central project. Like I said, people are desperate to believe in something, and if you get a situation with a central project, well, another classic example is how Christianity replaced paganism in ancient Rome. People stopped believing in the old gods, and it didn't matter what you did. It didn't. The social conditions had changed so much from when Roman polytheism emerged, and it was taken very seriously in the days of the Republic. But by the time you get into the late empire, hundreds of years later, almost 1,000 years later, it's not believable anymore. And people were grasping at mystery religions. There's an enormous body of scholarship in mystery religions in antiquity. There was Mithraism and I can't remember the other names of the cults, but Christianity was one of many mystery religions that took root among both the middle class and the lower class of the population. It was the one that proved to be successful.
I had a quick question. Basically, humanity really hasn't ever really come to terms with the concept of having something more intelligent than them to interact with in the ways that we interact with all the other species on this planet. And so whenever you look at, during World War II, when there were certain regions where islanders had never seen an airplane before, and infrastructure was set up in those areas, they were culturally affected from the outside in instead of from the inside out. How do you see culture if something like that was to happen? Would humanity be able to maintain certain moral aspects and certain cultural identity if something of that nature occurred?
Are you suggesting the possibility of an outside intelligence coming in and making us into a cargo cult or something else?
Not a cargo cult, but just assisting in different ways, but who knows what, either very aggressively or very passively or very in between.
We certainly could be faced with this problem. This is another thing that the existential risk community has pretty much converged on the idea of unfriendly AI as the greatest existential risk we face. So we have the possibility of confronting something more intelligent than us that way, and we have the possibility of gene editing to produce more intelligent human beings that could profoundly affect us. I don't think that we could say on the basis of anything we know now. I think that's a very hard question. I'm not prepared to answer it. If we had reached the point of where we were a spacefaring civilization and there were multiple independent centers, there's always a population that can exile itself and maintain its biological and cultural integrity. But human beings, large populations of human beings break out when they're subject to stresses. So you might get, when a country is occupied during a war, some people become collaborators, some people sit on the fence, and some people become resistors. So you're going to see a breakout. If human beings were to encounter a more advanced intelligence, I'm certain you'd see a breakout between those who sat on the fence, those who ran as fast as they could, and those who embraced their new masters and were happy to become pets on a leash.
Hi, yeah. I would like to ask you to clarify a little bit more about what you were saying with respect to the fact that you said human civilizations become more, I forget the exact word you used, like aggressive or violent when they lack this central project. But
Yeah, I said something like they become maladaptive.
yes, and if anything, I'm struggling with this a little bit because most of the civilizations that you listed as examples, if anything, used that central project in a way that resulted in, I would say, maladaption. And it's the more vulnerable or marginalized members of that civilization that paid the price. And especially, as we're looking towards the future and thinking about a possible unifying central project for a spacefaring civilization, how do we avoid that mistake of the past of having that central project turn us to violence and towards, turning against people that think differently or are more vulnerable members of the society? And especially as we start to talk about, you're bringing up genetic alteration and things like that. I think that's also adds a little bit of a creepy factor to it. And I was wondering if you could just comment on how that project might be defined or constrained in some way to avoid those mistakes.
There's no question that central projects in the past were very brutal to outsiders. I talked about the persecution of heretics in medieval society and the near absence of heretics in Egyptian society. And this is part of our legacy as human beings, that we form tribes and we persecute outsiders, and we have an in-group and an out-group. And yes, many people bear the brunt of that. There's a wonderful quote from Freud. It's horrific at the same time, it's wonderful, where he says, men can always be united in love with one another as long as their others are left over to receive their aggressive manifestations. Of course, Freud was a Jew living on the eve of the Second World War. He saw what was coming, and he knew very well who was receiving the aggressive manifestations in his time. But and we also know from very robust sociological data that in time of war, suicides plummet. People have something to live for, even if you might think it's a very good thing to live for. It's just a fact of the way human beings operate. Certainly the paradigm of what a society ought to be has changed dramatically, and particularly in the contemporary industrialized world in North America and Western Europe. We no longer find it acceptable to persecute minorities, and we want to try, ideally, I don't think it always works out this way, but we want a meritocracy in which anybody can achieve whatever their capabilities and effort will allow them to achieve. So clearly, if the North American, Western European model is what dominates the central project of civilization going forward, and if that's what's transplanted into a spacefaring civilization, you'll certainly find that. And you'll find a radically different social paradigm that's not based around an in-group, out-group division. But we don't know that it's going to be that Western-style individualism and respect for minorities that's going to be what ultimately translates into a spacefaring civilization or not. Does that address your concerns?
Actually, I'm going to be one of those jerks that make kind of a short speech and thinly guided at the question, but I know you don't mean any harm or anything, but throughout the entire speech, it just kind of felt like there's some type of extension of the colonialization language that has been spread throughout the world in the past, to kind of extend that into interstellar colonialization. And as Icarus has adopted the spaces for everybody theme, I think it's really important that we really think about the language that we use, and also the ideas that we propagate, because I know that my people like African Americans or Native Americans are going to listen to our ideas and read our literature, and they're going to think, well, these people just want to send all of these able-bodied, high intelligent people, probably not racially diverse population, out into the stars, and this doesn't involve me. And I feel like if we're really going to make space for everybody, we need to kind of get away from the colonialization language and the pure genetic language, and kind of expand our horizons a little bit. I just kind of felt like throughout the whole thing, I thought about the healthy population and the theorized healthy population and high IQ population, and I just don't feel like like the idealized population that would be inhabiting these space civilizations will necessarily include everybody. So that's just me though. I just kind of iffy about the whole idea. So I'm sorry.
There has been an enormous amount of recent sociological scholarship that has targeted that notion quite specifically. And people are, if you go into contemporary sociological studies, there's a lot of talk about the use of colonialist language, and obviously many people have likened interstellar expansion to the great colonial empires of Europe in the 19th century. As I just attempted to address the concerns of the previous question, I suggested that if the civilization we have now in the Western world goes on to be successful and to endure for some period of time, that we're going to see a lot less of that. There's always, because as long as I said, as long as we remain human beings, there's going to be an in-group and out-group because that's the way our minds are set up. But the reaction against colonialism and the excesses of the 19th century has left a permanent mark on Western civilization. And that's not going to change any more than the earlier permanent marks left on. And it changes the direction. When there's any, just like when the Vietnam War went on, you had, for the first time in American history, enormous protests in the streets against the war, which you didn't have in previous wars. And that experience of the war changed American life quite significantly as people looked at geopolitics and international relations in a very different way, and we still do. The legacy of the Vietnam War is still a living legacy in American foreign policy every single day. Nobody wants to be involved in a quagmire in the same way that nobody wants to be involved in a colonialist enterprise. So I'm certainly well aware that people see this expansionist vision. And I'm not saying it's going to come true. I'm saying we don't know what pathway our civilization is following. We can look and try to read the tea leaves now, see what kind of infrastructure that we're building now, and what that infrastructure is going to be used for. It could be used for several different things. And we don't know what those things are yet. All we can try to do is try to gain a better knowledge of ourselves, gain a better knowledge of the society in which we live, and try to be rational about it.
I'd like to interject here. I have found in my experience with Nick's ideas, first of all, Tiffany Fearson is deaf, and also she's probably the best lip reader I've ever met in my life. So that's something I'd like to point out. Secondly, I agree with a number of her criticisms of the language that Nick uses rather than a criticism of Nick's ideas or what he's saying. In my estimation of what Nick's saying, I often take what Nick is saying as a warning. Like, if we go in this direction, there are lessons from the past that can become an inevitability which we can, at this juncture, change or alter in a way that reminds me of Harry Seldon and the Foundation and that sort of directive thinking. We pay attention to these sort of languages. I particularly make a point of saying human space missions as opposed to manned space missions and things like this. I try not to talk about space colonies because of the history of colonization. However, as Nick just pointed out, there's a saying that if you build a house on sand, inevitably the house will collapse. Well, there is an argument that the Western civilization was built as a house built on sand. So we are working through that now contemporarily. And that's what we're working towards so anyway, I'd like to, I would like to close this session. It's a great session. Nick's going to be here. You can have a conversation with him. You have a question for me?
What sand would that be?
The sands of history. And I think we should all take 2 minutes break time to, because our brains are in hyperdrive right now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick Nielsen.